The night of Halloween in 1981 carried with it a kind of electricity that only comes once a year, when the ordinary rules of the world seemed to bend and the streets belonged not to adults, but to children in masks. Porch lights glowed like small beacons, casting amber halos on sidewalks scattered with fallen leaves. Pumpkins flickered with toothy grins, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. The laughter of children carried down every block, a strange mixture of innocence and eerie excitement, as if every giggle were half a dare whispered to the darkness. Among them were two sisters, one 12 and the other 14, walking side by side with bags already heavy with candy. Their costumes were homemade, simple, charming, imperfect in a way that said more about love than craftsmanship. The younger had been impatient all day, eager to run door to door, while the older had teased her, insisting she would collect more candy anyway. They moved together like shadows stitched by the same thread, their voices weaving into the chorus of the night. To an outsider, it was an ordinary evening, a familiar ritual replayed across towns everywhere. Parents stood in doorways, calling out warnings not to stay out too late. Streetlights blinked on, one after another, like watchful eyes opening in sequence. Cars crawled down streets at cautious speeds, their headlights glancing across groups of children darting across the asphalt. But beneath the surface of this playful chaos, there was a current no one could name. It was the kind of night where joy could slip too easily into unease, where the boundary between safety and danger blurred just enough to go unnoticed until it was too late. The sisters' footsteps echoed in rhythm, their sneakers brushing against gravel, their voices trailing off as they disappeared deeper into the neighborhood. No one could have guessed those steps were the last anyone would hear. Neighbors later recalled fragments, flashes of memory, small pieces of a puzzle that never seemed to fit. Some remembered the girls laughing with friends near a candy bowl left unattended on a porch. Others swore they saw them near the corner of a cul-de-sac, costumes glowing faintly beneath the streetlight. Still others thought they had seen them vanish into the swell of children weaving between houses. Each recollection was tinged with the unreliability of memory, warped by time, panic, and the strange way ordinary moments take on new meaning in hindsight. That night, however, the girls were simply part of the living tapestry of Halloween, a pair of sisters among dozens of other children, indistinguishable until they were no longer there. The house windows reflected their passing like fleeting ghosts. A dog barked behind a fence as they walked by. A candy wrapper slipped from a bag and fluttered against the curb. These details, meaningless in the moment, would later become the kind of things people replay endlessly, grasping for clues in the ordinary. The night was alive, but the sisters' presence in it was slowly fading, absorbed by the shadows between porch lights, swallowed by the blackness that filled the gaps between laughter. Each step they took was unknowingly carrying them toward the vanishing point, a threshold where time would close around them like a fist. For their parents, the night began like any other Halloween, filled with the cautious indulgence of letting their children have a small adventure in the safe familiarity of their own neighborhood. They expected the knock at the door, the burst of laughter, the sound of candy being poured out and counted. What they could not have imagined was silence, a silence that would grow heavier as the hours passed, transforming from mild concern into a gnawing panic that would never truly leave them. But for now, in these opening hours of October 31st, the family was still whole, the sisters still together, and the town still unaware that this night would etch itself into memory not as celebration, but as tragedy. There is something cruel in the way ordinary moments disguise themselves as beginnings to extraordinary losses. The sisters' disappearance did not announce itself with screams or broken glass. It arrived softly, like a candle going out in the wind, unnoticed at first. The sound of their footsteps, the sight of their small figures in costume, the laughter that followed them down the street, these were the last threads tying them to the world everyone else remained in. When those threads snapped, no one heard it happen. The Halloween night of 1981 continued as though nothing had changed, while two lives slipped quietly into the kind of silence that can stretch across decades. And though no one knew it then, the story of that night was only beginning, a story that would wait 43 years for a forgotten house to speak its truth. Their world before that Halloween was a tapestry of small, ordinary details, the kind that seem insignificant until they become the only things left to hold on to. The sisters were like most siblings, bound together by shared rooms, whispered secrets, and occasional arguments that ended as quickly as they began. The younger, 12 years old, was filled with restless energy, the kind of child who scribbled her name in the margins of notebooks, who loved to run barefoot in the grass, who collected shiny objects from sidewalks as though they were treasure. The older, 14, carried herself with the quiet authority of someone standing at the edge of adolescence, no longer a child yet not fully grown. She had begun to care about the way she looked in the mirror, had begun circling songs in magazines, had even started teasing her younger sister about the boys who walked by their house after school. They were opposite in temperament but inseparable in practice, two halves of a story that made the most sense together. At school, teachers remembered the younger girl as talkative, always raising her hand with answers that came tumbling out faster than she could think. Her notebooks were filled not just with math problems and spelling words, but doodles of stars, flowers, and the occasional lopsided heart. She thrived on attention, sometimes frustratingly so, and her friends followed her lead during games of tag or jump rope. The older sister was quieter in the classroom, a girl who sat by the window and stared out at the trees as though she were trying to memorize their shape. She was serious about her assignments, often scolded her sister for not finishing hers, and seemed caught between two worlds, the carefree nature of childhood and the looming pull of teenage independence. Teachers said she had a gift for writing stories, little pieces filled with drama and mystery, as though she had already been practicing for the tragedy her life would become. At home, their relationship was a constant back-and-forth rhythm. Mornings were a battlefield of who got the bathroom first, who borrowed whose sweater, who left a mess on the dresser. Evenings, though, were softer. They sprawled together on the living room rug, trading Halloween candy from the year before, playing cards, or watching the glow of the television until their mother told them it was time for bed. The younger one had a habit of sneaking into her sister's room, curling up on the edge of the bed under the pretense of being scared of the dark. The older would complain, shove her playfully, but rarely told her to leave. These were the rituals of their lives, the invisible threads that tied their days together, unnoticed until absence would tear them apart. The family was not wealthy, but their home was full of warmth, the kind of warmth built not from money but from familiarity. Their father worked long hours, often returning late, while their mother managed the household with a firmness softened by care. Dinner was simple, often interrupted by laughter or small arguments over chores. The sisters would sometimes conspire together, trying to delay bedtime or negotiate for an extra scoop of ice cream. The kitchen table bore the scratches of school projects, the faded stains of spilled drinks, the marks of a life both chaotic and loving. Neighbors recalled that the family kept to themselves but radiated a kind of openness. The front porch light was always on, children from nearby houses often played in their yard, and the sisters were considered part of the fabric of the block. The younger one dreamed of becoming a dancer. She would twirl in the living room when no one was watching, the hem of her skirt flaring as she hummed her own music. Her older sister wrote those dreams down in the form of stories, little fairy tales where princesses escaped towers, where heroines solved mysteries, where sisters always saved each other. There was a sense that even in their play, they were rehearsing roles they didn't know they would one day be forced to leave unfinished. Their bedrooms reflected their worlds, one littered with ribbons, toys, and posters of cartoon characters, the other decorated with magazine clippings, stacks of books, and a growing collection of cassette tapes. Their differences were visible in every corner, but so was their bond. Halloween itself was always a highlight in their household. They planned costumes weeks in advance, bargaining with their mother over materials and details. The younger wanted bright, playful designs. The older leaned toward something a little darker, more dramatic. Their compromise usually left them mismatched but somehow still coordinated, two costumes that looked unrelated to others, yet to them formed a secret pair. They spent afternoons walking through crunchy leaves, trading ideas about which streets gave out the best candy, and daring each other to knock on doors that seemed too intimidating. It was more than a holiday to them, it was an adventure, a night when they could step outside themselves, when the neighborhood transformed into a world of flickering lights and endless possibilities. Friends remembered their closeness, the way they laughed at inside jokes no one else understood, the way they finished each other's sentences. The older one was protective, sometimes overly so, scolding her sister for being reckless, for running too far ahead, for talking to strangers too easily. The younger teased her for being boring, for not knowing how to have fun. But even their arguments ended with the kind of affection that comes from being raised not just side by side but soul by soul. It was an intimacy forged in countless shared experiences, an intimacy that would make their absence feel like a wound the town itself could never heal. Looking back, their world seems almost unbearably fragile, like glass that could shatter under the slightest pressure. The routines of school and home, the jokes whispered in bedrooms, the plans for the future, all of it felt permanent then, as though it would continue forever. Yet in hindsight, those details read like the final lines of a chapter, moments unknowingly preparing to be frozen in time. What they could not have known was that the small joys of braiding hair, trading candy, and teasing each other would one day be all that remained for those left behind. Their world, so full of ordinary life, was about to be violently interrupted, leaving only memory to keep its shape. The night itself did not announce what it would take. It unfolded in small, familiar moments. Porch doors opening, bowls of candy offered, voices echoing in the cool October air. For the sisters, it was another round of trick-or-treating, the simple thrill of costumes, sugar, and laughter. They walked through the neighborhood with a lightness that only children could carry, stepping from light to shadow, from the warmth of glowing jack-o'-lanterns to the long black stretches of quiet between houses. Their bags filled steadily, wrappers crinkling, the weight of candy dragging their arms but never their spirits. Each doorbell pressed, each thank you spoken, each giggle rising into the night added another thread to what seemed like an ordinary holiday. Yet ordinary is often the disguise of tragedy. The sisters were seen by many, though no one realized it would be for the last time. A neighbor claimed they passed by his yard just after 7:30, costumes bouncing as they skipped along. Another swore she saw them closer to 8 o'clock, standing in line with a group of children at a house known for its elaborate decorations. The accounts grew fuzzy after that. One child said they had been headed toward the far end of the block, toward a street with fewer houses and dimmer lights. A mother recalled hearing them laugh, but when she looked outside a moment later, the sidewalk was empty. Each of these recollections, recalled later under the weight of panic, became both evidence and uncertainty. Memories bent and broke beneath the pressure of fear, and the sisters seemed to dissolve into the shifting fog of imperfect witness. Their parents expected them home by 9. It was not a strict rule, more a rhythm they had followed in past years, candy collected, streets quieting, costumes shed as the night wound down. When the clock reached 9 and the door remained unopened, their mother paced. She told herself not to worry, that perhaps they had lingered with friends, that perhaps they were finishing one last block. By 9:30, she was calling neighbors. By 10, the unease had taken root, wrapping itself around her like a cold hand. The father drove slowly through the neighborhood, headlights sweeping across sidewalks, expecting at any moment to see the familiar figures of his daughters returning home. Each empty corner deepened the silence in the car, each familiar street looking suddenly strange. The fear grew quickly, transforming from worry into the sharpness of panic. Their names were called into the night, voices trembling but loud, echoing into yards and alleys. A flashlight beam cut through hedges and fences. Dogs barked in response. Still nothing. The realization spread like a ripple, the sisters were not simply late. They were gone. By midnight, the police had been called. Officers knocked on doors, their questions urgent but careful. Did anyone see them pass by? Did anyone notice a strange car? Did anyone remember which direction they were walking? Parents roused their children from sleep, asking if they had seen the girls after trick-or-treating ended. The answers were scattered, contradictory, fading. The sisters had been part of the living flow of Halloween night, but somewhere in that current, they had slipped under, unseen. The candy bags, the laughter, the sound of their shoes scuffing against the pavement, all of it had disappeared, swallowed by the dark. For the parents, the waiting was unbearable. Each minute felt like a test of endurance, each hour confirmation of dread. The mother sat at the kitchen table, clutching the phone, dialing numbers again and again. The father paced the house, opening doors as if expecting them to walk in at any moment. Their rooms remained untouched, beds made, pillows waiting. The stillness was suffocating. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the gravity of fear. Flashlights moved in patterns across lawns, forming a constellation of searching beams. The sisters' names carried into the night, their syllables trembling in the air, unanswered. Police cruisers idled at the ends of streets, their red and blue lights painting houses with colors that felt alien and wrong. What had been a festive neighborhood hours earlier now felt like a stage for something unspeakable, the pumpkins' carved smiles twisted into mocking grins. Confusion gave way to desperation. Some believed they had wandered too far, gotten lost in their excitement. Others whispered darker possibilities, a stranger's car, a door they should not have knocked on, a corner where the streetlight no longer worked. No theory seemed too far-fetched, because none could explain the most haunting fact of all: two girls, side by side, had simply ceased to be. In those early hours, the hope that they would suddenly reappear still clung to everyone involved. Perhaps they were at a friend's house. Perhaps they had stopped to rest. Perhaps they would come rushing home, flushed with apologies, carrying their bags of candy like trophies. The parents clung to those possibilities with the fierceness of love, unwilling to let their thoughts wander further. Yet the longer the night stretched, the thinner those hopes became, until they were gossamer strands breaking under the weight of reality. What happened to the sisters in those lost hours is a question that has haunted the story ever since. Did they step into the wrong yard, drawn by curiosity? Did someone lure them with the promise of more candy, a shortcut, a ride home? Or did they vanish in a way no one could have imagined, slipping between the cracks of ordinary life? The truth, whatever it was, remained hidden, leaving behind only absence. By dawn, the neighborhood looked different. The decorations from the night before seemed grotesque in the gray light, their plastic skeletons and paper ghosts transformed from playful to sinister. Candy wrappers littered the sidewalks, evidence of joy turned hollow. The sisters' absence was now undeniable, an emptiness that stretched from their family's kitchen table to every corner of the block. The night had taken them, and no one could explain how or why. It is the ordinariness of their last hours that cuts deepest. There were no warnings, no alarms, no final goodbyes. Just two sisters walking down a street, costumes swaying, laughter trailing behind them, becoming smaller and smaller until they were gone. That was the cruelty of it. Life did not shatter in a single loud moment, but dissolved quietly into silence, unnoticed until it was already too late. The search began with the kind of frantic energy that belongs to the first hours of panic, when fear had not yet hardened into despair. Parents, neighbors, and police filled the streets as the October night turned to morning, flashlights bobbing in the darkness like desperate stars. Voices rose into the cold air, calling the sisters' names again and again, each shout thinner than the last, each echo carrying no reply. The yards that had been filled with laughter and costumes only hours earlier were now places of suspicion, every shadow a possibility, every silence a threat. Mothers clutched coats tighter around themselves, fathers pushed through bushes and fields, unwilling to stop even when logic told them nothing would be found. The urgency in those early hours felt almost holy, an unspoken vow that no child could vanish without every stone being overturned. The police organized their efforts quickly. Officers divided streets into grids, marking houses, empty lots, and wooded patches on the edge of town. Volunteers were given flashlights and maps, each instructed to report back with even the smallest sign, footprints, fabric, candy bags, anything. Children were sent home, tucked into beds that felt safer than the streets, though none of them slept. The sisters' faces were described again and again, repeated until they blurred in memory. One slightly taller, hair tied back, carrying a pumpkin-shaped candy bucket. The other in a darker costume, her laughter louder, her bag nearly bursting. These details became a litany, the only way to keep them alive in the collective search. By dawn, the search expanded. Cars drove slowly down rural roads, headlights sweeping fields where fog still clung to the ground. Farmers stepped out of barns, joining the search without being asked. Church bells rang earlier than usual, not for worship but as a gathering call, drawing out volunteers who carried nothing but determination. Even children who had trick-or-treated with the sisters the night before tried to help, pointing to the last places they remembered seeing them, though their memories contradicted one another and offered little more than confusion. Each account, however vague, was recorded, pinned to a growing map of uncertainty. The house-to-house knocks became relentless. Doors opened to officers holding photographs, to neighbors straining to remember faces in the blur of costumes. "Did you see them?" was asked so many times it lost its meaning. Some swore they had, others weren't sure, and still others shook their heads with guilt for not having noticed more. Suspicion began to creep in like a fog. Was someone lying? Was someone hiding something? The unity of the search was tinged with unease, though in those first days it was buried beneath determination. The parents remained at the center of it all, their grief too raw to be hidden. The mother stood on her porch for hours, scanning the horizon as though her daughters might suddenly appear. The father drove the same streets again and again, searching for anything overlooked, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Reporters began to gather, their vans parked along curbs, cameras catching every desperate plea. The sisters' photographs were printed in newspapers within a day, their smiling faces staring back at a community that had no answers. Flyers were taped to telephone poles, grocery store windows, the doors of gas stations, images of two girls frozen in time, smiling with the innocence of those who do not know how fragile they are. As days passed, the search deepened. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to clothing from the sisters' rooms, their handlers urging them forward into fields and alleys. Helicopters swept above, their blades chopping the silence, their searchlights slicing across woods and rivers. People combed through tall grass, ditches, and abandoned buildings. Every hour stretched long and merciless, yet nothing came of it. Not a shoe, not a scrap of fabric, not a single trail to follow. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The town grew quieter as exhaustion set in. Volunteers continued to walk the streets, but their voices grew hoarse, their steps slower. Fear had a way of muting the world, replacing certainty with suspicion. Parents kept their children indoors, locking doors in daylight, closing curtains at night. The laughter that had once filled the neighborhood vanished, replaced with the hum of police radios and the low murmur of conversations no one wanted to have aloud. The sisters were not just missing, they had become a mystery that threatened everyone's sense of safety. And yet, the search never stopped entirely. Candlelight vigils were held in the churchyard, flames flickering as prayers were whispered into the night. Children carried flowers to the sisters' front porch, laying them gently on the steps. Neighbors brought food to the parents, though few had the courage to step inside. The air was heavy with helplessness, but also with a strange kind of unity. For a time, the entire town breathed the same breath, carried the same burden. It was as if everyone believed that if they simply refused to let the sisters be forgotten, they might still come home. But the cruelest part of those days was not the lack of answers, it was the way hope shifted with each passing hour. Every phone call made hearts race, every rumor sent people rushing to another corner of town, every false lead crushed spirits just a little more. The search consumed everything, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and silence. By the end of that first week, the town had been scoured, yet the sisters remained missing. It was no longer just a search. It was the beginning of a story that would not end for decades, a story that would linger like a ghost in the air, haunting every house, every porch light left burning long after the candy was gone. Rumors began like whispers carried on the wind, at first soft and uncertain, then louder, heavier, weaving themselves into the fabric of the town until truth and speculation became inseparable. In the days after the sisters vanished, when the search had scoured every field and alley, people turned to the only thing left to fill the silence: stories. Some whispered that the sisters had run away, that perhaps they had grown restless with small-town life and had chosen Halloween night as their escape. The theory spread quickly, especially among those who did not want to imagine darker possibilities. But the parents rejected it outright. Their daughters had no money, no clothes missing, no plans hidden in notebooks. The sisters had been planning school projects, making lists for Thanksgiving, arguing about which records to borrow from friends. They had lives rooted too firmly in home to vanish by choice. Yet still, the rumor persisted, each repetition carrying the sting of blame. Others swore they had seen a van cruising the streets that night, headlights dimmed, moving slowly, too slowly, as if stalking. One neighbor insisted he noticed it turn down the very street where the sisters were last seen, but when asked to describe it, his memory failed him. Was it blue? White? Rusted? Every retelling shifted the details, and the van itself became more legend than fact, a phantom vehicle onto which people projected their fear. Soon, parents began pulling their children inside at the mere sight of a stranger's car, convinced that the shadow of that van still lingered on their streets. Then came the darker suspicions, the ones people spoke only in hushed tones, when they thought no one was listening. Fingers began to point inward, toward neighbors who had been eccentric or withdrawn, toward the teacher who walked home late, toward the quiet man who lived alone at the edge of town. Each quirk became evidence, each odd habit a clue. The town, once united in grief, began to fracture under the weight of its own fear. Trust dissolved. People who had once shared sugar and borrowed tools from each other's porches now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Every smile seemed suspect, every silence threatening. The police did little to ease the tension. With no concrete evidence, they too leaned into questioning those closest to the girls. Family members were interviewed again and again. Did the parents argue with them? Did the older sister ever talk about leaving? Did the younger one meet strangers through friends? The implication hung heavy. Perhaps the answers were not out there, but within the walls of their own home. Neighbors whispered about these interrogations, layering suspicion onto already grieving parents. It was a cruelty that stung deeply, the insinuation that the ones most desperate to find the sisters could somehow be responsible for their loss. As months passed, the rumors evolved. Some claimed to have seen the girls far from town, hitchhiking on a highway, walking near a bus station. Each report ignited a brief flicker of hope, followed quickly by disappointment when none could be verified. Hope and rumor became intertwined, feeding each other in a cycle that exhausted everyone. The parents began to dread phone calls, for they carried both the possibility of relief and the certainty of heartbreak. Each sighting that led nowhere deepened the sense that the girls had slipped not just from their lives but from reality itself. The town itself seemed poisoned by the uncertainty. Halloween the following year was subdued, nearly silent. Few children went door to door. Porch lights that once blazed proudly were left dark. Pumpkins rotted uncarved on porches. The tradition itself felt dangerous, tainted by memory. The sisters' absence was not just a wound to their family but to the entire community. Every autumn, the air carried the same chill, and with it the same unease, as though the night itself remembered. The cruelest part of the rumors was not their persistence, but their ability to reshape memory. People who had once sworn they saw nothing suddenly remembered details that fit the gossip. Stories warped to match suspicions. A man who had simply walked home late from work became, in the retelling, a shadow following the sisters. A van parked innocently on a curb became the predator's lair. In this haze of rumor, truth became impossible to hold. The line between fact and fear blurred, leaving only doubt. For the parents, the weight of these suspicions was unbearable. Not only had they lost their daughters, but they were forced to endure the judgment of neighbors, the cruelty of whispers that blamed them, pitied them, or worse, avoided them. Friends who had once been confidants now spoke to them with guarded tones, as if proximity to grief might be contagious. Their home became both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where the walls seemed to close in under the burden of rumor. The longer the case dragged on, the more the rumors hardened into legend. The sisters were no longer just missing children, they became symbols, invoked whenever fear or suspicion needed a name. Their story was retold at sleepovers in hushed voices, woven into cautionary tales for children. Don't wander too far, don't trust strangers, don't walk alone. The tragedy had transformed into folklore, a story with no ending, told again and again until even those who had not known the sisters felt the weight of their absence. Yet beneath all of it, the theories, the suspicions, the whispered stories, lay the most haunting truth. No one really knew. The town's certainty had crumbled, leaving only shadows. And in those shadows, trust eroded, innocence with it, and the memory of two sisters was pulled further and further away from who they truly were. They had been children, vibrant and full of life, yet rumor had stripped them down to silhouettes in a story everyone thought they understood but no one truly did. The silence of not knowing had become unbearable, and in its place people built a noise of their own making, rumors, suspicions, shadows that grew larger than the girls themselves. The trail of the investigation bent and twisted through the years, becoming less of a straight line toward truth and more like a labyrinth that seemed designed to confuse anyone who entered. In the weeks after the sisters disappeared, investigators clung to any thread, no matter how thin. They followed leads into neighboring towns, questioned strangers who had been passing through, and chased down tips phoned in by people who swore they knew something, anything, that might crack the case. Yet every lead unraveled, every thread slipped away, leaving behind only frustration and exhaustion. It was as if the night had swallowed the sisters whole and spat out nothing in return. Detectives who first handled the case spoke of their certainty that the solution was close, that a break would come if they just pressed harder, searched one more field, knocked on one more door. But the days bled into weeks, and their optimism turned brittle. When winter rolled in and the snow covered the town in white silence, hope seemed buried under the frost. The case files grew thick with notes, interviews, and photographs, but none of it formed a picture. The investigation felt less like building a puzzle and more like holding a box full of pieces that belonged to several different puzzles, none of them fitting together. Then came the tips from outside, strangers who claimed visions or dreams of the missing girls, psychics who promised clarity if only the police would listen. Some families in grief might have embraced these voices, but the parents found little comfort in them. The police entertained a few, if only because desperation left no room for dismissal. One psychic described a house near a lake, another insisted the girls were alive in another state. Each claim fizzled out, leaving behind a sense of humiliation, that their daughter's tragedy had become a stage for others' theatrics. The FBI became involved briefly, their presence casting an intimidating shadow over the small-town offices. With them came the promise of advanced methods, profiles of potential suspects, and strategies for narrowing the field. For a moment, it felt like progress. Agents mapped the sisters' last known movements, reconstructed their route home, interviewed classmates with stern precision. But even their presence could not conjure answers from absence. When they eventually stepped back, leaving the local department to carry the weight, it felt like abandonment. The town had hoped for closure, instead, it received silence. Over the years, investigators cycled in and out, each new detective inheriting the burden of the case. Some arrived with enthusiasm, determined to be the one who solved what others could not. But the case files swallowed them whole, their pages dense with contradictions and dead ends. The more they read, the more tangled it became. Witness statements conflicted. Memories shifted over time. Evidence degraded or was lost entirely. Files were misfiled, reports went missing, and in some corners of the community, whispers suggested negligence, or worse, cover-up. Though nothing could be proven, the mere suggestion further eroded trust in the authorities. The parents, meanwhile, lived in a cycle of hope and despair dictated by the investigation. Every time the phone rang with news of a new lead, they braced themselves. They learned to measure time not in years but in next steps, A new detective, a new tip, a new theory. Each ending was the same, empty. Their grief became a rhythm of anticipation and collapse, leaving them weary yet unable to stop hoping. To stop hoping would mean admitting their daughters were gone, and that was a cruelty they could not bear. There were moments when the investigation took strange turns, almost surreal in their futility. A piece of clothing found near the woods turned out to belong to another child. A set of bones discovered decades later was revealed to be animal remains. A confession from a drifter in another state unraveled when details didn't match. Each false lead was not just a failure but a reopening of the wound, as if the family were forced to grieve all over again each time. As the years passed, detectives began to speak of the case with reverence, almost fear, as though it had become cursed. Younger officers heard about it in hushed tones, the Halloween disappearance, a file they all knew but none wanted to inherit. For them, it was less an investigation and more a ghost story, one that haunted the station. The sisters became part of the lore of the department, invoked whenever another case seemed too tangled to solve. Meanwhile, the community's memory of the investigation grew warped. Some residents claimed the police had been too lenient, too slow, too unwilling to accuse the obvious suspects. Others argued they had been too aggressive, turning neighbors into enemies and sowing distrust. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between, but the anger stuck. For some families, the handling of the case became proof that they could never rely on those sworn to protect them. For others, it was an uncomfortable reminder that some mysteries simply could not be solved, no matter how many badges pursued them. By the time 4 decades had passed, the case had gathered dust in every sense. The parents had grown old under its shadow, their hair gray, their movements slower, but their eyes still burning with the need for answers. The box of case files sat heavy in the evidence room, thick with the ghosts of interviews, photographs, and reports that led nowhere. It was not just a mystery anymore, it was a scar carved into the identity of the town, a symbol of failure that no one wanted to touch but no one could forget. The investigation had not died, but it had transformed into something else, a cycle of repeating questions, echoes of theories long disproven, and a silence so vast it became louder than any clue. In that silence, the sisters' absence became eternal, their story drifting further into the realm of legend. For the detectives who had once promised answers, and for the parents who had once believed them, there remained only the question that had haunted them from the beginning: how could 2 children vanish into nothing? Decades later, when the town had grown older and the memory of that Halloween night had dulled into a kind of resigned silence, the past refused to stay buried. It happened almost by accident, as so many revelations do. A developer had purchased a parcel of land that contained a crumbling, long-abandoned house on the outskirts of town. To most, it was just another relic, one of those sagging structures that children dared each other to approach on summer nights, its windows broken, its roof caving inward. The house had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, yet it had always seemed strangely untouched by time, as if the air around it discouraged curiosity. The demolition crew arrived one gray morning, their truck stirring dust along the neglected road. They expected rot, mold, perhaps a raccoon's nest, but not history. When one of the workers pried open a warped cellar door, a wave of cold air poured out, the kind of chill that seemed older than the earth itself. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, beams catching on cobwebs and forgotten objects stacked against the walls. At first, nothing seemed remarkable: rusted tools, broken furniture, old newspapers yellowed into brittle sheets. But then, in the far corner, half concealed by a collapsed shelving unit, lay something that drew them all still. It was a box, small enough to be overlooked, large enough to hold the weight of memory. Dust coated its lid, but the moment one of the men brushed it clean, he noticed initials scratched faintly into the wood, 2 sets, childish in their scroll, familiar to anyone who had lived in town long enough to remember the names of the missing sisters. The room thickened with silence. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, each feeling the gravity of what they had stumbled upon. This was no ordinary trash left behind in a forgotten basement. This was a remnant of a story that had haunted the town for over 4 decades. The police were called, though many of the officers on duty had not even been born when the girls vanished. The sight of the box, its surface scarred by time, carried a heaviness that silenced even the most seasoned among them. When they opened it, carefully, reverently, they found objects that froze the air. Small trinkets, items once ordinary but now sacred relics of lost lives. A ribbon faded by dust but still recognizable as the kind the younger sister loved to wear in her hair. A notebook with childish doodles etched into its corners. And at the bottom, a photograph, curled with age, of the 2 girls smiling in the summer sun. It was as if the box itself had been waiting to be found, as if the house had been guarding its secret all these years. Word spread quickly. By evening, the forgotten house was no longer forgotten. Crowds gathered at the edge of the property, their voices hushed, as though they were standing at the edge of a grave. For the older residents, the discovery reopened wounds they had learned to live with. They remembered the search parties, the rumors, the sleepless nights. To them, the house was no longer just a ruin, it was a container of grief, a keeper of something unspeakable. For the younger generation, who had grown up hearing fragments of the story passed down as warnings, the discovery transformed myth into reality. The sisters were no longer just names in hushed tales, they had been real, and they had been here. The police cordoned off the area, investigators arriving with cameras and evidence bags, their movements methodical, professional, but also tinged with awe. Every object in the house was catalogued, every corner photographed. The cellar floor was scraped for traces, though time had done its work well, erasing what might once have been clear. Still, there was something about the presence of the items, so intimately connected to the sisters, that felt like both a revelation and a torment. The parents, now elderly, their bodies bent by years but their grief still sharp, were brought to see the objects. For them, it was a cruel kind of resurrection. To touch the ribbon, to see the notebook, was to feel the presence of their daughters again, yet in a way that only deepened the loss. These were not the answers they had prayed for, not the reunion they had dreamed of. Instead, it was confirmation of absence, proof that their daughters had been taken into a shadow they could not escape. Tears came not in bursts but in slow, silent streams, the kind that carved deep lines into their faces. The house itself became a character in the story, looming over every conversation. People speculated endlessly, who had lived there at the time of the disappearance? Why had it never been searched thoroughly? How had something so close remained hidden for so long? Old records were dug up, revealing that the house had changed hands multiple times in the early 1980s, tenants moving in and out quickly, as if unsettled by something within its walls. Yet none of the owners had ever stayed long enough to draw attention. Its silence had been its shield, protecting its secret until chance cracked it open. In the days that followed, the town was gripped once more by unease. The discovery did not bring closure, it brought questions sharper than ever before. If the sisters' belongings were here, what else had happened within those walls? Were they brought here against their will? Was this where their story ended, or merely another chapter? Theories flared again, igniting the same old fears, but this time grounded in physical evidence that could not be denied. The forgotten house had become a mirror, forcing the town to confront not only what had happened but how they had allowed themselves to forget. For 43 years, it had stood at the edge of memory, dismissed as another relic of time. Now it pulsed with meaning, a structure transformed from ruin to reliquary. The past had returned, and it demanded to be seen. And in that demand lay the haunting realization. The truth had been waiting all along, not buried in distant places or lost in rumor, but sitting quietly, patiently, in a house everyone had walked past and ignored. It was not just the sisters' story that was unearthed that day, it was the town's failure to face what had been before them all along. The cellar air was heavy not only with dust, but with guilt, with the silent weight of decades wasted in blindness. The discovery of the house was not the end of the mystery. It was its rebirth. The door that had once been closed was now wide open, and what lay inside it threatened to change everything the town thought it knew about the night two sisters vanished into the dark. The discovery of the house and the strange box of belongings sent shockwaves not only through the town but also through the corridors of law enforcement. What had once been treated as a cold case collecting dust in the evidence room was suddenly thrust back into the harsh light of investigation. Forensic teams were called in, their vans parking outside the sagging house like sentinels of modern science standing guard over an ancient wound. The cellar, once just a place of shadows and mold, was transformed into a crime scene. Floodlights illuminated every corner, cameras clicked, gloves snapped onto hands. After decades of silence, the house was finally asked to speak. The forensic experts moved carefully, knowing that time was both their enemy and their challenge. Dust, rot, and neglect had done their quiet work over 43 years, erasing many traces that might once have been obvious. But modern technology had ways of finding ghosts where the naked eye saw nothing. Luminol sprays shimmered across the floor, ultraviolet light revealed faint smears, and soil samples were collected from the cracks in the foundation. Every fiber, every nail, every splinter was tested as if it might hold a secret. What emerged was not a full picture, but fragments, disturbing fragments that suggested the house was more than just a forgotten structure. Hidden in the cellar walls were fibers consistent with clothing from the early 1980s. A rusted hair clip, dull with age, matched the style the younger sister had often worn in photographs. Beneath the floorboards, a small stain, barely visible to the human eye, tested positive for traces of human blood, degraded but undeniable. The DNA was too broken to confirm identity, but the implications were clear. This was not just a hiding place. Something had happened here. The revelations were enough to send the town spiraling back into fear. For weeks, the local papers ran headlines that blurred the line between fact and speculation: evidence of violence in forgotten house, sister's fate closer to being solved. Yet beneath the surface of these reports was a truth more unsettling. No one could still say for certain what had taken place. The belongings in the box spoke of captivity, perhaps of fear. The stains in the floorboards whispered of violence. But there was no body, no clear narrative, only fragments that suggested an unspeakable story without ever finishing its sentence. For the parents, the forensic discoveries were almost unbearable. To hear that the ribbon and notebook were not lost trinkets but evidence, to know that a stain in the floor might be all that remained of their daughters, was to experience grief sharpened into a new blade. They sat in silence during the investigators' explanations, eyes hollow, hands clutched together. 4 decades they had begged for truth, but truth, when it finally arrived, came in pieces too cruel to hold. The forensic revelations also reignited suspicion. Old names resurfaced, old suspects dragged back into conversation. Who had lived in that house during 1981? Who had keys to the cellar? Records showed a landlord who had vanished into another state, tenants whose histories were marked by instability, one man whose reputation in town had always been whispered about with unease. The police began knocking on doors again, interviewing neighbors who were now elderly, their memories fogged by time. Some claimed to remember strange noises from the house that year. Others insisted they had always avoided it, sensing something dark inside. But memory, like the evidence, was fragmented, reliable only in pieces, distorted by rumor and fear. Even as the forensic team continued their work, the case became something larger than science. It became a mirror in which the town was forced to see its own past negligence. Why had the house not been searched more thoroughly decades earlier? Why had it been dismissed as irrelevant when it had stood so close to where the sisters were last seen? The realization that answers might have been found sooner, that closure could have come years earlier, brought anger to the surface. For some, the authorities had failed not just to solve the case but to protect the town's innocence. Yet beneath the anger was something quieter, more haunting, the realization that closure might never come. The objects in the box, the stains in the floor, the rusted clip, none of them could speak in full sentences. They whispered, but they did not tell. The sister's story, once thought to be lost, was now alive again, but it remained unfinished, dangling like a shadow just beyond reach. The forensic revelations had opened a door, but what lay beyond it was not resolution. It was more mystery, more ache, more silence stretched across time. The house, once an abandoned ruin, became almost sacred ground. People left flowers at its gate, lit candles in memory of the girls. Some prayed there, believing the sisters' spirits lingered in the place that had stolen their lives. Others avoided it altogether, unable to stomach the thought that such cruelty had unfolded in their own neighborhood. The house had become both shrine and scar, its cellar the place where truth and silence coexisted uneasily. And so, while forensic science had given fragments, it had also left a void. The townspeople realized that even with modern methods, some mysteries refused to be solved in neat lines. The forgotten house held the key, yes, but not the entire lock, not the entire story. It had given enough to remind everyone of the horror that had been hidden in plain sight, but not enough to offer peace. The ghosts of that night still lived, not just in the evidence bags and reports, but in the hearts of those who had carried the story for 43 years. The truth, partial and fractured as it was, had returned. But truth in fragments is sometimes more haunting than no truth at all. The cellar had spoken, but what it whispered was not a conclusion, it was an echo. The revelations from the house spread through the community like smoke, creeping into every corner until no one could ignore it. 4 years, the disappearance of the sisters had lived as a half-remembered story, tucked away in the back of people's minds, softened by time. But now, with their belongings pulled from the shadows of a forgotten cellar, the tragedy surged forward again, raw and unhealed. Conversations in grocery store aisles, at church steps, and over backyard fences all circled back to the same subject. What happened in that house? Who was responsible? And how had the truth been hiding in plain sight for so long? For older residents who remembered the original search, the discovery felt like reopening an old wound that had never properly healed. They remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, combing fields with flashlights, calling out the girls' names into the night. They remembered the cold sting of November air as hope dwindled. To them, The house was not just a place, it was a symbol of failure, a reminder that despite their collective effort, they had missed something essential. Some carried guilt that they hadn't thought to look closer. Others carried resentment toward the authorities who had declared the